Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Ariel Shoshan, and I have the privilege of welcoming our partners from across the country and across the world. There are almost 60 organizations together in 22 American states, in Canada, in Israel, the UK, and in Panama. And last week we were privileged to have 1,100 people together, and this week we can already see the numbers growing as we are here to learn from Dr. Pelcovitz. This is a most exciting time, and of course a very serious time. And we hope that everyone is continuing to be safe and healthy, especially as things are reopening. We should continue to daven. You know, as we started some 8 weeks ago, we were very focused on davening for people's well-beings and for the well-being of our communities. And now as things are getting a little, tense again, perhaps, remember that the Ribono Shalom Hashem listens to our prayers, and we should continue to daven and be successful. We are very specially privileged to welcome Dr. Pelcovitz here. And I'm going to make a few words of introduction in a moment. First, I want to thank our series sponsor, the family and friends of Yafa Sarah Bas Yehuda HaKohen, who sponsored the entire series in her honor. And she is a woman of great care and focus, who lived in Chicago and recently passed away. Also, thank you to Lenny and Jessica Weiss of Lincolnwood, Illinois, who are sponsoring today's lecture in honor of Dr. Pelcovitz in appreciation for their long relationship. Their daughter was a student of his and friends with his family. And so we are thankful to them for providing this to everybody, and thankful to all of our sponsors throughout the series. It should be a bracha for all of you. Thank you again to our partners in WeLearnTogether.org, as well as in J-Pulse Boston, who are working so hard for the technical parts of making this possible. It's all of that you see here are many, many people coming together to bring you an opportunity to learn and grow. I just want to share a small idea which came up yesterday in the learning of Pirkei Avos. As many of you know, we study the ethics of our fathers during this time of year, and yesterday we learned the 5th chapter. And in the 5th chapter, there's a record of the 10 miracles that happened during the time of the first Beis HaMikdash, during the time of the first temple. Perhaps the most well-known of them is recorded in a few words, where the Mishna says, Omdim tzvufim lishtachavim revachim, that the people who were there were standing close together with no space. Tzvufim means that they were tightly packed. It was an uncomfortable closeness. And so one would imagine that if you're standing together in the courtyard, when it comes time to bow, and bowing means to prostrate oneself all the way on the floor, legs and arms out. So it would be impossible without a miracle for everybody to be able to bow. And so the Mishna records that you could go there and see this incredible miracle, that they were standing there together, but mishtachavim revachim, they would bow with space. Now, I always thought the truth is that if the purpose of the Mishnah is to tell us about the miracle that we assume it to be, that they were able to bow even though they were packed so tight while standing, because you can imagine you can't bow on a packed subway car, then it would record it in the following way, Omdim tzvufim umishtachavim, that even though they were standing close together, they were capable of bowing, they were able to bow. But that's not what it says. It says, Omdim tzvufim, they were packed together while standing, mishtachavim revachim, but when they were bowing down, each person had space. It wasn't just the ability to bow, it was the ability to bow with space. And I think there's a very, very deep lesson in that miracle. The lesson is applicable to all of our lives every day, which is that if we stand, if we're omdim, if when I walk into the room, I'm standing with my back so straight, concerned about my own well-being, concerned about my own honor, if I stand and I don't bow, if I'm not contrite, then life is tzvufim. Then life is always bearing down on us. Then we feel a sense of this isn't fair and that's not fair and I'm not getting the proper respect that I deserve. But if a person will be mishtachavim, if a person will be among those who bows his head, a person who is contrite, a person who actually looks up to the Almighty and says whatever Hashem is doing is for the best, then revachim, then life is lived much more spaciously. And it's not just that in that place this miracle happened, but in every place, an attitude of omdim, an attitude of what about me, what about my honor, leads to tzvufim, leads to being all crowded out. But an attitude of mishtachavim, of bowing, of being contrite, of admitting, of thanking, of all the things that are involved in being a little bit more humble, leads to revachim, leads to wide open spaces. And this is also reminded, we were reminded of this in yesterday's Parsha when we learned about the Shemitah. The Shemitah year is a time, and the Yovel even more so, that we give the world back to God. It's the year, the 7th year in the cycle, when people in the land of Israel are not allowed to reap and they're not allowed to plant. And they have to rely upon Hashem a little bit more, maybe a lot more. Really, that's true about every Shabbos. Every Shabbos, we turn our reliance onto Hashem. As Rav Hirsch writes in the beginning of Chorev, in the chapter about Shabbos, he writes that when we observe the Shabbos and when we celebrate the Shabbos, we're giving the world back to Hashem. We're admitting that I am not the all-powerful owner of anything. I'm just the governor of it. I'm just the one who's been given a borrowed authority to create within this world. That whole sense of accepting upon ourselves our smallness can in many ways lead us to, in difficult times, taking things a little bit easier. You know, I'm not the expert, and we do have the privilege of hearing from an expert today. But one of the things that I think comes up often is when we learn to rely upon others. We learn to rely upon others whom we know, the almighty higher sources, then everything can calm down a little bit. And maybe I'm touching on something, maybe I'm totally off base. But I think that we all have the opportunity to have learned now that we are interreliant, and to see so many people together, so many organizations together, reminds us of how we can rely upon each other and we can hold each other up and get through whatever we're going through in a difficult way. So to whom do you call when you need to know how do we go forward? Sometimes you need to call a Torah scholar. Sometimes you need to call a professional in mental health. And there's the rare individual who actually is both. And the answer to the question, to whom do we call? We would ask our teachers, we would ask the authorities, whom should we call? But it's evident from watching how the Orthodox Union, Agudos Yisrael, and many other organizations turn to Dr. Pelcovitz in times of need, that we knew from the beginning, to whom can we turn when we want to ask the real questions of what does the research yield? What does the Torah teach us about how we are supposed to get through difficult times? Without further ado, it's really an honor for me to introduce somebody whom I've heard speak many, many times, Dr. David Pelcovitz, the Strauss Chair of Education and Psychology at Azrieli Graduate School and Yeshiva University, a clinical psychologist in private practice, and an authority on so many things that so many great people turn to. Dr. Pelcovitz.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Shoshan, first of all, for your beautiful, beautiful words, and for just pulling this together with your amazing team. So it's incredible the reach that this program has. It's truly inspiring. And also, let me just say that any words of Torah that we'll go over in the next hour or so are dedicated to the memory of Sarah Bas Yehuda HaKohen, who unfortunately passed away just this week. And personal thanks to Lenny and Jessica Weiss, who, family who I know, as well as their daughter, who was my student at Stern. It's just a pleasure to see that you helped make this happen. So thank you. So let me start with talking about. I'm going to start by talking about the work of. I'm going to focus first on the work of Dr. Susan David. Dr. Susan David is a professor at Harvard Medical School. And what I love about her approach to resilience in the time of COVID-19 is that it's tied to values. And it's tied in particular to values in a way that I think resonates with this particular group from all over the world. Her first point is a point that virtually any expert on resilience says, which is the number one rule is be kind to yourself. It's, we have to always think about our relationship in terms of our relationship being Adam La'atzmo, our relationship with ourselves and our inner work and our inner growth in response to these unprecedented times, but also in terms of our relationship, in terms of our relationship with God. But what she talks about is a very practical approach to help bring order to chaos. So the first way to talk to yourself is to see the fear that we might be feeling, or at times even panic that we might be feeling, as just our body doing its job. It's the most natural thing in the world that in the time of danger, we're going to go into fight or flight. Okay? And we have to give ourselves permission to be human beings, which means that we're going to have these strong feelings. We have to notice the feelings for what they are and create a space in ourselves that says that we're not defined by fear. That's step one. It's just permission to be a human being. Step two, that she says, is the power of naming the monster. And the power of naming the monster means that just by saying to yourself, okay, I'm anxious, and maybe I could handle it, maybe at times I'll feel that things are out of my control, but just even labeling it is something that could be an engine of growth. And in fact, there's some fascinating research that shows that as we name an emotion, and even if we do nothing other than to say, okay, I'm anxious, and then even say to ourselves, okay, but I've been anxious before, let's look at what might work here. Just the naming lights up the language center of the brain, and it's already the beginning of the refuah, the beginning of the healing. But then this is where she gets to be unique. It says, ask yourself, what is the function of any emotion that you have? She says that every single emotion is a flashing arrow about what we care about, okay? So for example, let's say the emotion is grief, sadness at a loss. Then to just say to ourselves, okay, fine. What's the function of that emotion? It's an emotion that says that we care deeply about the people we've lost. Maybe that we care deeply about people who we need to now reach out to. And then how do we act on it? So it may mean that if we're worried about elderly grandparents, that we pick up the phone or initiate a Zoom call or start a FaceTime session just to reach out to them. That's the most powerful way of dealing with a powerful emotion, is to transform it into action that's in consonant with our values. That takes us from passive to active. You know, there's a fascinating metaphor that is discussed in the passage in Ha'azinu. It says, "Kanesher Yair Kino Al Goz Olav Yirachem." I'll translate everything. Don't worry. Here's the deal. Here's what I'm talking about. It's and I'll embed it in a very brief vignette. On 9/12, September 12th, okay, the day after the World Trade Center attacks of 9/11, I was at a talk. Actually, I was asked to give a talk, but the main speaker was Rabbi Matisyahu Solomon from Lakewood, Mashiach from Lakewood. And his opening, it was a horrific time. The audience was a huge audience, but filled with people who, many of whom had been directly impacted, many of whom who were Hatzalah members, who had, you know, some injuries and remarkable stories about the miraculous nature of none of them being killed. The opening line of Rabbi Solomon was, why is it that of all the animals in the world, in a time of tsaros, were compared to an eagle? It says, "Kanesher Yair Kino Al Gozolav Yirachem." What is it that's unique about an eagle? He says, because eagles, when the baby eagle is in danger, the mother eagle hovers around the nest and waits for the baby eagle to jump on her back and then she flies higher than any other living being, which means that if a hunter tries to shoot her down, the baby will still be safe. But that baby wasn't in a passive position. That baby was in an active position. And his point was, is that at a time like this, we always have the option, no matter how horrific the loss, and no matter how horrific and hard to believe the situation is, we could deal with it. We could go from active to passive. And in fact, what the research shows us is fascinating because it's very consonant with Jewish thinking. Research shows the following. It shows that if we have a situation where we're under tremendous stress, again, like a COVID, a COVID kind of chronic stress, we have a choice at that point to either relate to it as feeling like a log stuck on the river at the mercy of the current, being in a totally passive place. That is something that, Rabbi Yoshever Soloveitchik in his writings would talk about. That's being in a place of go roll, randomness, lottery, sort of you're just at the mercy of the current. Or, Soloveitchik would say, you always have the choice to go from go roll to yiyud, to go from a place of randomness to a place of feeling that I'm a person of destiny. When you're a person of destiny, it's a whole other deal, because you say to yourself, how can I grow from this? Now that may sound a little premature for us to be talking about it now, but I think we've all experienced a little bit on lockdown that if we choose and are able to discipline ourselves in any way we can, although it's totally okay if you're having a hard time doing it, but to say, okay, maybe I'm appreciating my children more. Maybe I'm appreciating my neighbors more, my wife more, my best friends more. To the extent that we could go from go roll to yiyud, to destiny, it makes all the difference in the world. The president of Yale University says the following. He's done all kinds of research. His name is Dr. Salovey. He was a psychologist, head of the psychology department there before he took over the presidency of Yale. And Dr. Salovey, rather brilliantly, has a whole body of research that shows that responding to ongoing stress, especially at times like this, in a way that you see the engines of growth. He calls it post-traumatic growth. How can I grow from this? If you're able to see ways of growing, it makes all the difference in the world. Okay? So he uses, as a classic example of post-traumatic growth, I'll just share with you there are a number of things. Actually, I'll just share with you, actually, going back. His name is Salovey. That's short for Soloveitchik. He comes from the same family as the Rabbi Soloveitchik I quoted before. Okay, there's sort of, they came to the same conclusion, totally each not knowing the work of the other, and came up with the same basic truth. You do much better psychologically when you're able to see how you can grow and what you could appreciate with what's going on. And it's a phenomenal thing. But let me share with you, this is the thing you should take for notes. This will be on the final at the end of the talk today, okay? Here's what it says. Ilu nafalti lokanti, the Medrash Tehillim tells us. If I never fell down, I never would have gotten up. Ilu yashafti bachoshech lo haya orli. If I never sat in the darkness, I never would have appreciated the light. It's a phenomenally wise explanation of post-traumatic growth. One of my favorite studies that Dr. Salovey often talks about is the hotel maid study. He looks at a group of hotel maids, and he randomly assigns them to one of two groups. One group is just asked to do what hotel maids do all the time. The other group is told You're part of an important wellness study that'll help us understand wellness in the workplace. So here's what we're asking you to do. We're asking you to just think about how everything you do is good for wellness. So as you shake out the sheets to change a bed, you're working your upper biceps. As you're vacuuming, just think about how you're working a different muscle group. And also as you're dusting and reaching high, you're working on your aerobic, improving your aerobic functioning. And they take every single thing they do, which is exactly what the other group does, which is exactly what they've always done. But it's imbued with meaning and imbued with purpose and imbued with the belief that what I'm doing matters. And after a brief period of time, after, if I remember correctly, I think it's only after 4 months, the women who were in the group that thought they were part of a wellness study, which they were, they lost a lot of weight. They weren't trying to lose weight, but they lost weight. Their low-level depression gave way to happiness, and their general sense of well-being improved. Our immune functioning is actually improved anytime that we're able to focus on the kind of approach that we're talking about here. Going from feeling stuck to feeling positioned makes all the difference in the world, okay? And then to go back to Dr. David, what about guilt about parenting, that we're losing it with our children, let's say? Well, that's a signpost that we care about our children. What do we need to do maybe to take that feeling of guilt and channel it in a constructive way to action? Maybe we need to spend more time one-on-one with our kids. Find ways of stealing time with our kids, even if we're cooped up in a little apartment. There's always a way to steal time, okay? And that's the sort of values-based approach of Dr. David, which I find resonates with me tremendously. But then there's a final point of what she makes, which I wanted to share with you. And that's the power of writing. The power of art, the power of writing, the power of humor is incredibly important as coping mechanisms and as resilience building in the times of COVID-19. And what is a wise expert on resilience once said, art is making something out of nothing, humor is making nothing out of something. But writing is bringing order to chaos. So she just says a simple thing. She says, sit down for a few minutes with paper and ask yourself, in the midst of the chaos, who do I want to be? What is important to me? Okay? Or prepare yourself to answer the 3 questions that Yaakov's family prepared him. He was preparing his army, Yaakov, to go with a fateful encounter with his brother Esau. And here's what he tells his family and his army. Be ready to answer the following 3 questions. Not a bad set of questions to think about in a time of our history that we maybe have some extra time and space, especially on a long Shabbos, okay, to be able to ask core questions about our lives. Here are the 3 questions. Who are you? Where are you going? And what are you going to do with what you have? Okay, who are you? Where are you going? What are you going to do with what you have? Who are you? To the extent that we could cue into our signature strengths and the signature strengths of our family members, it's a golden thing to be able to do. It's an amazing thing to be able to do. To the extent that we could cue into answering the question of where are we going? What are our goals? You know that if you imagine for yourself what your goals are going down, where do I want to be in the best case scenario 10 years from now? If all my dreams work out, what would it take for my goals to be reached in terms of personal goals, in terms of family goals, in terms of goals for my spiritual growth, in terms of goals for where I'm going professionally? And if you focus on that, the research shows for 4 days in a row, by just writing it out, don't worry about the grammar or anything, 2 things will happen. Our happiness levels will go up, the research of Dr. King shows, but also it makes them more likely will reach those goals. As it says in Mishna, as it says in Proverbs, Be'ein chazon yifara'am. Without that vision thing, you lose yourself. And any time you do that, it moves us from values as abstract to values as front and center. So that finishes the part I wanted to talk about in terms of Dr. David's work. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about managing anxiety. And I'm going to talk about it on 3 channels. Because these are the 3 channels that are probably the more powerful ways of dealing with feelings of panic and anxiety. One channel is cognitive. Okay, what are we thinking? Or as the Baal Shem Tov said, you want to know where the person is? Look at where his or her thoughts are. Okay, number 2 is physiologic, which has to do with the ability to be mindful and to step back, which is all important. Okay, and then behavioral, which is the whole idea of avoiding avoidance. So let me start with cognitive, and I'm going to share with you a little story on the cognitive components here. Okay, goes like this. Okay, few years back, I was giving a scholar in residence talk in a large shul in Jersey. And after Kiddush, back in the days you could go to Kiddush. Who knew that we shouldn't take that for granted? After Kiddush, after davening, I was asked to give a talk on mensch making. How do we bring Jewish values to our regular job of raising children, raising grandchildren, or instilling values into the next generation? It was a large audience, there were about 400 people. But in the back of the audience, there was a 6-month-old baby and a young mother, and the baby was crying hysterically. The mother couldn't calm the baby down. And it was sort of hard to hear me speak in that room, given the nature of that room. And I kept trying to ignore it, but I couldn't. But people in the audience were getting really angry at the woman. They were saying, leave, we can't hear him. And she refused to leave. She was invested in hearing the talk. And it became very tense. Suddenly, right in front of me, there was a man, front of the room, an elderly man, and he gets up and he turns to the audience. And here's what he says. He says, you all know that 70 years ago, I was liberated from Auschwitz. I survived Auschwitz. And you all know that 70 years ago, I came to this community. You all know me. This is the place I made my community. And you're not going to be surprised to hear what I'm about to say. It's that if you would have told me 7 decades ago that, you know what's going to happen in 7 decades, the day's going to come where there's going to be a room filled with 400 people crammed together, 400 Jews, who are totally invested in taking the wisdom of the Torah and bringing it to their life and raising children. I would have said impossible. I couldn't have believed that 400 Jews would survive. I thought we were all really finished as a people. He said, but then if you would have told me, guess what? In the back of that room, there's going to be a crying baby. And that crying baby is going to be very annoying to people. They're going to be very angry, but the mother's going to insist on staying in because she's very anxious on trying to integrate the lessons of the Torah to raising a Jewish child to internalize Torah values in child rearing. I would have said, you're out of your mind. And then with tears in his eyes, he looks at everybody. He says, do you know what a miracle this is? You know what a miracle this is? A Jewish baby and a mother who's so invested in raising the Jewish baby to grow up to be a mensch. He says, you're witnessing a miracle. 2 things happened. The baby stopped crying. The baby stopped crying because there's no longer any tension. The mother no longer felt tense. The audience wasn't transmitting tension and anger to the mother. And the second thing that happened is more long-term. Ever since then, this was many years ago, must have been at least 30 years ago. Ever since then, every time I'm giving a talk somewhere and I hear some noise in the background, it could be from children running around, it could be from a crying baby, I say in my head, Baruch Hashem, thank God. Thank God. It's permanently shifted my perception. Now that's cognitive behavioral psychology in terms of anxiety. That's taking that which makes us anxious and bringing it to a place that we're able to talk to ourselves and be able to calm it down. And this was a permanent change in the way I process it. Next, in terms of the physiologic part of this, let me just grab something I want to read here. Okay. Let me not. Okay. I want to talk to you about the power of a break. The power of a break. Let's say you're lucky enough to be living in an area where you could go out on a nice spring day and go for a walk, obviously with proper kind of social distancing. So you go out for a walk. Or let's say you can't, you're not lucky enough to be living in that kind of situation, you're compromised or whatever. You have to stay in your apartment or in your home. And you allow yourself to daydream. You give yourself a break. You say, look, I need a break. I can't just continue with my work. I can't continue with the parenting and the homeschooling and all of that. And you just give yourself a break. What research in the last decade has shown, what will light up in your brain is something called the default network. The default network is the part of the brain that lights up when we're not thinking. And guess what happens at that moment? At the moment that we're shutting down and being mindful and living in the present, okay? And we're just toning things down. At that moment, we're at our most creative. That's when our best ideas come. Sometimes it's when we just are able to take in a normal breath in, a slow breath out, and mindfully be able to shut our minds off. It sometimes happens best with walks in nature, which this time of year, in many parts of the world, I hope allows for. But if not, we could do this wherever we are. And remember the power of daydreaming and the power of also being able to take a break. There's a fascinating Gemara on burnout. Here's what the Gemara says. It says, Rabbi Zera, Cholash migirse. He actually, he became a little burned out. I don't know if that's exactly the way you should translate it, but he was having a hard time going on with nonstop kind of learning. So he figured, the Gemara tells us, he did three things that are not bad in terms of times like this. First thing he did was he moved to a different place. I don't mean you should all move to different places. Obviously, it's not an option now. But he changed his venue. I think for us, it might mean going for a walk, or it might mean changing our headspace or what we do. But he changed his venue. So what he did, the second thing he did, listen to what he did. He goes to another town, but he doesn't want to go into the Beis Medrash to learn. He sits outside of the Beis Medrash. And any time one of those rabbis left, he stands up out of respect. So he shifted his activity from passivity, okay, or from learning nonstop, where his brain seemed to need a break, to standing up out of respect. And the third thing that he did was he opened himself up to the ideas of others. There was a young boy walking by, little kid. And he said, what did you learn in Cheder today? And the kid said, I learned the bracha you make on dater, some food. I don't know exactly what it was. And he tells Razera what his Rebbe told him the bracha was. Razera says, no, that's wrong. Your Rebbe's wrong. Go tell him he's wrong. This is the bracha you make on dater. And then the Gemara just puts in and says, it turns out the boy and his Rebbe were correct. And Razera was wrong. Meaning that, as the beautiful opening words of Torah that you heard from Rabbi Shoshan, he opened himself with humility to the thoughts of others. Every one of those things has a place in building resilience, okay? Sometimes changing the channel, maybe you start learning something you haven't been learning. Maybe open yourself up to the ideas and thoughts of others. You know, if we talk to our kids, they're going to sort of shut us down, you know, especially if you have adolescents at home, or if you have preschoolers. Well, you have adolescents for sure. Okay, just imagine when you were adolescents. Could you imagine what it would have been like to have been stuck in an apartment or in a home with your parents without being able to hang out directly with friends for week after week, month after month? Could you imagine a bigger nightmare for an adolescent? I can hardly picture a bigger nightmare for an adolescent. And instead, what we have to say to ourselves is that we have to have empathy. But maybe we could open ourselves up to a new relationship with our children, and especially with our adolescents. Maybe we could start to share with them things that we haven't shared with them in the past. Now, direct communication often doesn't work. You'll get a lot of I don't knows. But instead, just start talking about something that is of interest to you. Start talking about, I don't know, if you hear the music that they're into, ask them a little bit about it, and then start telling them about, you know, when I was your age, let me tell you about the music I was into. And as you start talking about that, it's amazing how communication could start to open up. You know, there's a magnificent, magnificent thought that I often heard from my father, Zal, who was a rabbi for 65 years in Far Rockaway, New York. On the border of Far Rockaway and Lawrence in the 510s. So here's what he would often quote. It says that kachitzim biyad gibor came b'nei hanaurim, okay, which means that our model for child rearing should be, we should think about ourselves as like an archer. So child rearing is like an archer. So the Kutzker asks, what's the connection between chinuch, between education, and being an archer? So he answers, because just like with an archer, the closer you hold the bow to your heart, the further and straighter the arrow goes. So too with raising our children. The closer we hold them to our heart, the further and straighter we go. Don't waste a crisis, to quote one of the political leaders of the United States. Don't waste a crisis, okay? You know, the Chinese word characters for the word crisis is 2 word characters: danger and opportunity. It is a time of danger, but it's also a time for amazing opportunity. Let me start to get to a couple of concluding thoughts, because I know we have to. Rabbi Shoshan, how much time should I give myself?
You can certainly speak without any reservation for 10 more minutes if you want to take questions.
Got it. Okay, so let me start going to finish a couple of points. Number one, on the panic point and on the anxiety point, I'm going to quote the words of Dr. David Rosemarin from Harvard University, who wrote in an article in Scientific American. He happens to be a frum Jew and really a brilliant psychologist, the head of the Center for Psychology and Religion. And here's what he wrote in a Scientific American article right after this all started. He said the following: we can't tolerate situations that are uncontrollable and uncertain. Indeed, we can't control or predict what will happen next with COVID-19. In reality, self-quarantine and social distancing can slow but not stop viral contagion. But ironically, and this is the key, once we accept the reality that our sense of certainty and control is an illusion, once we understand and appreciate our inherent vulnerability, we emerge with the inner strength to face crises with greater equanimity. Okay, so that's just one point I wanted to make. Okay, next point I wanted to make has to do with a little bit about the need to be empathic with our children. I'm sure we all know this, but to understand that this is particularly hard for children, just like we need structure and routine now more than ever as resilience builder. Little kids, especially preschoolers and adolescents. I was part of a team that did some studies on the post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis in its fourth iteration. And one of the things we found is we asked the question, what are the toughest times in life to go through a traumatic time? And it turns out we were surprised. Preschool, because preschoolers are concrete, and also adolescence. Those are times that are particularly difficult. So we need to understand that our kids are going to be more difficult now. We have to choose our battlegrounds with them. Remember that just like we're wired for connections with others, children are especially wired for connections with others. And isolation from friends is difficult and confusing. Being unable to see grandparents except virtually can be extremely difficult. Feeling stuck in an apartment and an inability to go to, to just go and hang out in the most natural kind of way is extremely, extremely challenging. So sit down with your kid. Name the monster. To be understood, first understand. Ask them, what is it that you understand about what's happening now? And then give them an avenue for talking about it. Listen empathically. The Hebrew word ozen, ear, is etymologically tied, is tied to the word maznayim, which is the inner ear. It's the source of balance. Maznayim means the scale. And when we listen and we encourage questions and we validate feelings and consider use of art, writing, and music, and we explain to them that not every respiratory disease, not every cough or every cold is COVID-19. It's incredibly helpful. And we have to check back with our children when the situation changes. Let me make a couple of concluding points before 10-2. Okay, this is from Dr. Tal Ben-Shachar, famous Harvard professor, now professor at IDC in Israel. In a brilliant talk he gave on building resilience in the time of COVID, he talks about the following important points. We have to allow ourselves to experience the full range of emotions. And here's his point. Stress, anger, and love, let it flow through you. All emotions, he reviews the research on this, flow through one pipeline. If I block one, I'm not allowing joy and love room. Or like Golda Meir said, those who don't know how to weep with their whole heart don't know how to laugh either. So that's just one point that I wanted to make on that. And then an incredibly important point, I can't end without this, and it's the point of gratitude, how incredibly important gratitude is, okay? We all know that. The very word to be Jewish, Yehudi, comes from Leah saying, Hapam Odes Hashem, that she had more than her fair share of children. And gratitude, to the extent that we could build that into our lives and have and ritualize it in some way. So let's say every Friday night we go around the Shabbos table and come up with 3 things from the week that our kids are grateful for, that we're grateful for, and we share that with our children. It's associated with better immune functioning. It's associated with higher levels of happiness, better sleep. And it may sound like I'm making this stuff up. There are literally hundreds of studies on the power of gratitude and what it does and how key it is. So let me just end. Oh, and well, okay, I'll control myself. Let me just end with one final story, okay? And then we'll go to the questions. Here's the concluding story. There was I'm dueling with myself about which of about 5 stories to share, but I'll control it. Here's the conclusion. There was I'm going to change it from a story to a parable for the sake of time. I'll get away from gratitude for a second. Okay? And I'll talk about a magnificent parable from the Duvna Maggid that I think gets to the core of the meaning-making part of what we're talking about. He talks about a king who was a very insecure king. And he had a crown that he kept on his nightstand every night. In the center of the crown was a diamond bigger than the Hope diamond. Every night, before he would go to sleep, he would take the crown off, look at it, and feel, look, I have the biggest and the best in the land. Have this sort of a sense of security from it. One morning he wakes up, there's a flaw right down the center of the diamond. And he sees it as a horrible, horrible kind of omen. He says, my God, my Hope diamond at the core of my crown is flawed. It means I'm at a terrible risk. What does this all mean? And he puts out a call to the kingdom. Anybody in the world who could fix this flaw, I will make wealthier, like beyond their wildest dreams. People come from all over the world. Try to fix the flaw in the diamond. You can't. The flaw in the diamond can't be fixed. A little old Jewish jeweler comes in, okay? And he takes an engraving tool and engraves leaves around the flaw that now becomes the trunk of a tree that makes the diamond even more beautiful than it was before. What's the nimshal? What am I talking about here? What I'm talking about here is, I think, something that we have to remember. Okay? Resilience is ultimately about connection. It's ultimately about perception. It's ultimately about being there for the people we care most about, being there at their side. Okay? Being there in a way that we're helping them feel connected and that we're with them. Imo anochi b'tzara, Kadosh Baruch Hu tells us. And he tells us also, Hakol b'kivui, everything comes with hope. And he says, Yeshua comes with kivui. Geula comes with kivui. Dealing with tough times comes with kivui. The Bereshis Rabbah tells us. What we have to remember, though, is it's true. These are tough times. And there's been a lot of loss. And we're worried about future loss coming. And we're worried. We're worried about what's this doing to our children? What's this doing to our sense of invulnerability? What we have to remember is that what I firmly believe is that what this kind of program is all about. It's all about us finding a way of being there for our children, for our family, and for our community. And engraving magnificent leaves. We can't undo the flaw, but what we can do is we could grow from it. And again, I'll end with the bracha of full refuas hanefesh and refuas haguf for everybody. Rabbi Shoshan.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pelcovitz. Really, you just always lift us up. Really appreciate it very, very, very much. I have opened the chat in the corner, probably on your screen, it's in the corner, that allows you to type in any questions that you may have for Dr. Pelcovitz, and I will present the questions as they come in. So I have one question that's not for him, but yes, you'll be able to access the recording later, and all of the recordings are on welearntogether.org, and you can find them there from the previous events. A question that came in is, what are 3 things that one can do to cultivate resiliency in our youth?
Yeah, excellent. So number 1 is, I can't emphasize enough the importance of structure and routine. I know that sounds almost boring and not terribly filled with hope or complexity, but structure and routine really makes an enormous, enormous difference. It's important for us, but it's especially important for kids. So that's number 1. Number 2, chesed. Olam chesed yibana. The world is built on acts of loving kindness. Okay? We need to remember that, and we need to give them, it's called required helpfulness in the psychology literature. We give them acts of chesed to do. We give them, even little kids, chores to do. You give them, I have a little 2-year-old granddaughter who's, sheltering with us. We just, we give her a vacuum cleaner, she's in heaven, like, a little kid's vacuum cleaner, okay? We have her help clean up and things like that, and she's just like the happiest person in the world. Not every kid has that kind of temperament. By the way, she's name is Ella, originally from Chicago, from the sort of our own Salvation's great granddaughter. From there's that Skokie connection. But the bottom line of that second ingredient is try to figure out. I know it's counterintuitive. Try to figure out a way to get them hooked into that. And the third ingredient, I would say, is all about connection. Stealing time with them. Every night a week that we have dinner with our children without any interruptions going on, there's correspondingly lower levels of risk for drug abuse when they're adults. Okay? This is like, interesting research done by at Columbia University by Dr. Califano, who used to be the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare under President Johnson. But there's been a number of studies that show, again, just the power of time and connection and being at their side, even though we can't be at their side all the time. But just to steal some time with them where they know that there's nothing more important to you at times than to be able to steal time with them. And those three, I think should definitely go into the mix.
Okay. There's a question here. Thank you for that. There's a question for here about any resources or books or articles regarding anxiety in general that you would recommend.
Yeah. So I have a reading list. You go on I have a website. It's just called davidpelcovitz.com. It's a free website. You can just go on it. And you'll see some talks there on anxiety. And in the talks on childhood anxiety, you'll see a number of references, but if I could just recommend one book for you. Hold on. There are many books, but this book is, I think, very practical. It's by Alice Boyes, Boyes. It's called The Anxiety Toolkit, Strategies for Fine-Tuning Your Mind and Moving Past Your Stuck Points. Very practical, very easy. I know in the times of COVID, our brains get a little stuck. It's a little hard to pay attention to. This has a lot of really very, very practical interventions for perfectionism and for panic.
Okay, there are several questions coming in about particular groups of people, individual types, like older people who are more isolated. What do you recommend for them? Particularly, one question came in, is this what I have to look forward to? That I see my family, but I can't really interact with them, longer term. And one particularly meaningful question that was sent to me privately is about engaged couples. What support can you suggest for engaged couples that are going through this life of preparation alone, with both worry about the wedding and their inability to be together?
Yeah, I hear. So in terms of, let's take it question by question. In terms of older people, I apologize for not having put that front and center. There are many ways, and it's extremely difficult to have a family member or any older person in your neighborhood who's all alone. We're coming up on Shavuos. It's just heartbreaking to think about all those people who are alone in their apartments or in their homes. But don't underestimate the power of a phone call, of a Zoom call, or if you're allowed to, which certainly even in New York, where I am, we arrange ahead of time. We'll say there's for example, there's one particular widow who's living not too far from us, who we might arrange to walk over to her, I don't know, at 5 p.m. on a Shabbos afternoon, and she comes out and stands on her terrace, and we stay very safe distance behind, and we talk to her. I don't think it matters that we're doing that. It's just that she knows she's not alone. And she knows that we and a lot of other people are always checking in on her, okay? It just makes a difference. Calls make a difference. You have a choice between Zooming and texting, okay? Zooming, especially if you don't multitask, is incredibly helpful. I find, I know it's not ideal, but look at this. Look at what you're accomplishing and how many people are being reached in this series through Zooming. Texting is a little cheaper. It's colder. In research on offering words of support, even over a cell phone, to somebody who's distressed versus text call of support. So it's texting for support or words of support. Cortisol levels, blood pressure, pulse rate goes down with the soothing words. The very same words over text do absolutely nothing. In terms of the question about singles, I have one unmarried child left who, Mirza Shem, is going to be getting married at the beginning of September, one way or another. Okay, in other words, Mirza Shem, she's getting married, and we just had a. We made very clear, no matter what she's getting married, there's a lot of planning that we could be doing. There are a lot of support groups out there. If I could suggest something that might be helpful, Why You Connect, which is been responsible for many hundreds of shidduchim in the, in that segment of the community, including a wider range of people than one might think. They had a wonderful webinar on dating in the times of COVID. It was with Rabbi Dr. Glatt, who's a very prominent specialist in this area, and the head of the hospital, and also the Rav, one of the Rabbanim in one of the largest shuls in New York, in the 5 towns. So Rabbi Dr. Glatt gave a talk. I said Dr. Efrat Sabalovsky, social worker in charge of Why You Connect, and they came up with, and a number of other people, Marjorie Glatt, and they came up with very practical things that people could do to meet each other. In terms of people who were engaged, there's a lot that could be done that could be beautiful. It just happens to be interesting. Just before this, I ran from a meeting that we had over Zoom with a photographer, because we know there may only be there may not even be a minion at the wedding, but the photographer told us in a very kind and empathic way how he's been handling these kind of weddings, and he showed us pictures of how meaningful these weddings are. And then everybody knows that there are going to be ways to market later on. Again, I don't want to in any way, there's many ways, it's a complicated question. But we've had some webinars for engaged couples, also newly married couples who are living in lockdown with their brand new in-laws for months and months. Could you imagine being locked down with your new mother-in-law and father-in-law? They talk about post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay, so but even that, there are ingredients of resilience.
Dr. Pelcovitz, I'm going to give your phone number to my son-in-law, who just has been here, stuck only a couple months after his wedding for quite some time.
The fact that he's still talking to you and will take your phone number, I think that's an amazing. Speaks very well of you, Rabbi Shoshan.
One more question. We were asked, now, especially in places outside of New York, there's a lot of reopening going on. So there are practical elements. We're talking about social distancing, all kinds of rules and shuls and so on and so forth. But if you could speak to any guidance about the tension side of that, or anything that you feel in this transition, one can, how we should be thinking and how we can improve our lives.
Yeah, look, there's gonna be a lot of tension about it. There's gonna be a lot of tension because people are gonna have different levels of and different standards of how even physically close they want to get to people. You know, Dr. Fauci gave a beautiful talk with Rabbi Howard at the OU that made it very clear that you have to go slow and you have to be very careful if you're in a high risk group. And we have to remember that the last thing we want to do is feel responsible for bringing back for going too prematurely and bringing back an illness that some of the more vulnerable people in our home might have. It's a terrible thing to see. I've had to work with some people who were careless early on and then lost family members. You know, we'll never know for sure it was definitely because of them, but they did lose family members. And they, whether they did it or didn't, they're gonna be guilty and feel terrible about it for the rest of our lives. We need to have caution. We need to listen. I would just recommend that Aguda has come out with some wonderful, wonderful materials, and their guidelines I think are amazing. You know, their head, you know, Chaim David Zwiebel is a, you know, brilliant writer and thinker. And Rabbi Howard, who's you know the new head of the OU, is also a brilliant thinker. His video with Dr. Fauci, who by the way, Dr. Fauci said, "Please, I want you to daven for me." He said, "Please, I need your prayers. I need your prayers." But they give very clear guidelines that we have to listen to and pay attention to, and you know, go slow. We have to go slow. We don't want to have anything on our head later on.
Okay, I'm going to conclude the session by first thanking Dr. Pelcovitz for, as always, being so clear and instructive and helping us all to know how we can go forward. There are many, many recordings and articles written by Dr. Pelcovitz available, and he's been a great resource to the Jewish community across the world throughout this crisis and for many years. And so thank you again and again. And I'll remind everybody who's here that exactly at the same time, next Sunday, we have the privilege of hearing from one of the greatest Torah minds of our time, one of the biggest poskim of the world, Rav Asher Weiss, who has himself undertaken, it's impossible to describe what responsibility he's undertaken during this coronavirus. He's even published 2 volumes of tshuvas on the various halachic elements and other guidance. And really, it's a unique privilege in the days leading up to Shavuos to be able to welcome him and bring him to so many of you. So come back exactly the same time next Sunday. We look forward to being together with all your partners and all your hosts and having the privilege of hearing Rav Asher Weiss. Have a wonderful day. Keep on growing, be Mekadeh Shem Shamayim, and do great things today for your family. Thanks again for being with us.
Thank you.